Reddit. Have you ever had a close encounter with a well-known criminal or serial killer? I'll go first. Part 2. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I went to Virginia Tech and had a class with Sung-Hwai Cho. On the first day, he introduced himself as Question Mark from Planet X. He didn't speak the rest of the year. When the professor asked him to read a passage aloud, he walked out and didn't come back for a few days. He started stalking one of the girls in the class until she called the police. This was about a year before the massacre. Not really a close encounter, but my grandmother was murdered by Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. Edit. There isn't really just a whole lot to the story. My grandmother and her husband, not my grandfather, owned a book or liquor store in Austin back during the 1970s. Toole and Lucas just happened to be driving by, got out of their car, walked in and shot my grandmother in the face 3 times, and then turned it on her husband. They never actually caught Lucas and Toole. The two sat across the interstate drinking beer and watching the sheriff's department conduct their investigation. It was only years later, when the building had been changed into a bank, I believe, and Lucas was being transported in a squad car that drove by the place, that he said, "Me and Otis killed a man and woman in that building." My father, who is now a hotshot attorney, was a cop for years, and he even agreed that they knew far too much about the case and about what happened inside that was never released. So yeah, kinda crazy. This was back in October of '79, so I wasn't even born yet. I've posted this before, and the guy wasn't a serial killer per se, but a murderer nonetheless. About 8 years ago, I was in 4th grade. There was a new kid at school who had been homeschooled up until this point. I'll call him Steve. Come to find out that this guy lived about 3 houses down from me, just outside of the circle of people I knew. We became decent friends. I hung out at his house, he hung out at mine. I thought his parents were kind of strange, but I never told him that. After 4th grade ended, his parents decided to start homeschooling him again because his mom and her 3rd child are on the way. I thought we could be friends still, but his stepdad decided to build a 9-foot fence around their entire property. Fast forward to about 3 years ago. I noticed that his stepdad had built another ring of fencing on the inside of the old one and added some buildings and an awesome-looking playground in the back. We start calling it the Steve compound. About a year and a half ago, I noticed his stepdad had started raising emus in their yard in North Carolina. Fast forward again to about a year or so ago. I heard gunshots in the middle of the night at about 1 a.m., 3 of them. Steve's stepdad had come out of the back building of the compound where he had been sleeping because he and Steve's mom were estranged and drunk. He killed Steve's mom, Steve, and then himself. Steve was 15 years old at the time. His sisters, who I believe were 7 and 9, and his grandmother got out unharmed. TLDR. In 4th grade, I befriended a kid who was later murdered by his stepfather. Nothing serial, but I got swimming lessons from a man who, 2 years later, was convicted of manslaughter. He drove his friend's girlfriend to a house where the friend killed his girlfriend with a shotgun and then used it to kill himself. My ex-swimming teacher was convicted for bringing her to the house knowing what the friend was planning. Zachary Bowen delivered produce to me in the kitchen of the bar I worked at in the French Quarter of New Orleans. The woman he killed and cooked served me drinks at the Spotted Cat probably twice a week after Katrina, before he jumped off the roof of the Omni Royal Hotel and thereby ending the late night sneaking into the pool that had been our only respite from the summer's heat. He blew all of his savings on a massive cocaine-fueled party that I barely remember. He might not be notorious anywhere except New Orleans, but this was an effing gruesome crime that won't soon be forgotten here. My stepmom used to carpool with the Green River Killer. This was about 30 years ago. They worked together and both lived in Federal Way, Washington State. I remember when they caught him, she was kind of dumbfounded. My great-grandfather was a sheriff here in Texas. He got word Bonnie and Clyde would be passing through the area. He quickly rounded up some backup and attempted to head them off. They were too late, though. Missed them by minutes, apparently. He used to tell the story and then say that they were the luckiest days of his life, because if he would have caught up with them, they probably would have killed him. My great-grandpa was next-door neighbors with Jack Ruby, the guy who killed JFK. After Oswald was killed, my great-grandpa was the only one keeping the media firestorm from breaking into Ruby's apartment. Also, my great-grandpa saw a man practicing his shot at a shooting range a week earlier. He later realized it was Oswald, using the same gun that would take the president's life. Carol Ann Fugate had Sunday dinner with my family back in the late 60s or early 70s. We lived in York, Nebraska, where she was serving time at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, and it was some kind of church-related, obviously a proved brief time away from the prison for her. No one famous, I guess, but I grew up in a really small, close-knit neighborhood where everyone's kids played together, with the exception of one boy who was always dodging the crowd and getting into trouble. When I was in high school, news broke that he had stalked and killed his pregnant girlfriend. I still see his mom sometimes, and it's kind of odd to skirt the subject. Growing up, I was friends with two brothers who lived the next block over from us. I was pretty young, but I remembered them having a dad, and then I remember their dad not being around. They also were out of the neighborhood for a while, but not for too long. Years later, my mom told me that their dad was abusive and out of control. Their mom moved herself and the boys in with her best friend while she tried to end the relationship. One day, the dad went over to the best friend's house and killed the best friend in an attempt to get at their mom. We were all pretty young when it happened, so I don't remember how they reacted to the whole thing, and I clearly had no idea what had happened until later. Edit. Growing up in isolated northern communities leads to some seriously twisted things. In 2006, a guy who lived in the bush that we had encountered a few times when we were hiking was reported a number of times for animal abuse because he had something like 75 dogs, and people didn't think he was treating them properly. By law, finally got involved and decided to head out to his place and take the dogs. It took them a bit to get there. He is a ways from town, and somehow he heard that they were coming. The guy shot all of his dogs, and when the authorities arrived, he was sitting on a pile of carcasses. He felt that if he couldn't have and abuse his dogs, nobody could. And then he had the nerve to try to sue the people that reported his abuses for libel and slander. I once worked as a counselor at a state penitentiary, so I've met several serial killers and a lot of murderers. As most people have noted, under low stress and in conventional non-threatening environments, they all behave like anyone else. I've known some really nice guys that were doing time for murder. Serial killers are very different from run-of-the-mill murderers. The few I've known seem to have a distinctive undercurrent of crazy. The only prisoner that ever threatened to kill me was a serial killer serving many multiple life sentences. Not me, but a teacher of mine. In the late 70s, she had started a local community theater. At the time, the box office was a small outbuilding set a little ways away from the theater, both buildings in a residential but heavily wooded area. She was working the box office one evening and went to the main building to check on the progress of rehearsals. Things started to wrap up, and she needed to lock up to leave. She realized that she'd left her keys in the box office, so she went back through the wooded area to get them. When she got into the box office, her keys were nowhere to be found. After looking around extensively and still not finding them, she had one of her other staff people lock up, and she called her husband to come get her. A few days later, Ted Bundy was captured just a few miles away, and one of the things he had with him were her keys. When I was a kid, my dad saw Cary Stayner when we were visiting Yosemite. Cary Stayner is a serial killer in the area who beheaded 4 women and is currently on death row. I think he was working at the campsite that we were staying at the time. My dad only found out that he was a killer after he read about him being arrested later that year. He said that when he saw him, he felt really uneasy about being around him. He said that it's one of the few times in his life that he had met someone who just seemed like they had a screw loose. Also, one of his patients was the victim of a murder in San Diego. It was really big news in San Diego at the time, and they had a lot of people looking for her. When they found her, they came to his office for her dental record so they could be identified. My mom's boyfriend lived next door to a couple that was murdered by their schizophrenic son. He chopped them into pieces and burned their bodies. My mom was over at her boyfriend's house the night they were murdered, and she remembers smelling something burning. She said that it smelled strange, and that it smelled like something was burning, but it wasn't the normal smell of wood burning, or something like that. Not me, but a dude they brought into my English class in 10th grade. He was a lawyer that for some time worked at the World Criminal Court. On his first day, he walks into a courtroom to watch a trial, and sitting on the stand is some African leader, the man who chopped off limbs and enslaved people to mine for diamonds. Now, as soon as the lawyers walk in, the African leader switches from French to English, but because the leader went to college in New York, he has this Brooklyn accent. So now, this mass-murdering war criminal is describing the slaughters of hundreds of people in this Brooklyn accent. Pretty soon, the judge asked him why he's speaking in English. He then nods his head at the lawyer and says, "For the American." One friend of mine shot a cop. I hadn't seen him for a few years by that time. Another friend of mine killed some studio owner in San Antonio. They slit his throat. I did acid with that guy for my first time a few months before. I also was almost attacked by my friend's uncle. He had apparently knocked some guy out and choked him to death, then buried him on the beach. He never got caught. He didn't like me at all. I had another friend who shot his best friend in the face accidentally while they were tripping and drunk. He didn't go to jail. Another guy I knew was on acid with his friend in the woods, and he shot him accidentally and went to jail for it. Another time, I was in the holding tank in jail for marijuana possession, and they brought in a huge, muscular, shirtless black dude. We started talking, and he was really cool. He asked me why I was there, and I told him. We talked about weed for a bit. Then I asked him, "You have to, right?" He had just been in a fight. Not so bad. But wait, he was an ex-Marine, and he had just gotten out of prison for murder. He beat a dude to death for talking to his girl. He was worried that the fight he'd just been in may have ended that way too. And for the same thing. Effing creepy, sitting in the holding cell after you know the guy is capable of beating you to death.